On the 1st of July in 2011, a group of approximately 150 activists gathered here in front of a chocolate store in Melbourne, Australia to protest. The chocolate shop in question is called Max Brenner, a franchise that began in Israel in 1996. Bearing its founder's name, the chocolate cafe became very popular and now operates in 5 countries. In 2001, the franchise was bought by the Strauss Group, Israel's second largest food and beverage company, who employ 11,000 people across 16 countries. The Strauss Group offers moral support and care rations to the Israel Defense Force, specifically the Golani and Givati brigades. They stated on their website, "Our connection with soldiers goes as far back as the country, and even further. We see a mission and a need to continue to provide our soldiers with support, to enhance their quality of life and service conditions, and to sweeten their special moments." While these comments were later removed from their website, the Strauss Group continues their support. The Golani and Givati brigades are elite segments of the Israeli Defense Force. They were directly involved in Operation Cast Lead, the war on Gaza in 2008 and 9. Over the years, these brigades have earned a reputation for human rights violations. The connection between Max Brenner, the Strauss Group, and the Israeli Defense Force's military occupation of Palestine was enough for Australian pro-Palestinian activists to target the chocolate cafe as part of the global boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. Upon hearing of the protests, Max Brenner himself said the following: "Everything to do with conflict seems stupid, whether it's in Israel or not. Anything to do with violence, aggressiveness, or appearing at protests or boycotts seems silly. But then again, I'm just a chocolate maker." Pro-Palestinian activists staged a series of protests against Max Brenner. At one such protest, on the eve of Friday the 1st of July 2011, the situation escalated. I spoke with Omar Hassan and Vashti Kenway of Students for Palestine, who were present at the protest.
On arriving in QV, we found for the first time a line of police had formed out the front of Max Brenner, a picket line, you might call it. And so we formed in front of the police, had some chanting, made some speeches, declared the intent to be a peaceful demonstration and so on.
1 minute after forming this line, a group of riot police dive into the crowd to arrest one activist. The police targeted activists who they perceived as operating in a command and control function. A list of targets had already been assembled, which explains the seemingly arbitrary nature of these arrests. The police used a technique called wedging, where 5 or 7 officers storm into the crowd to arrest one pre-selected target. The police repeated these heavy-handed tactics a few months later with their violent crackdown of Occupy Melbourne. Footage like this clearly reveals the excessive and unprovoked force deployed by the police in an attempt to crush this peaceful protest.
So I was one of the first protesters to be arrested, and the police essentially came out in groups of 6 or 7, and these were huge riot police, led by the head police officer who was in charge of the evening, and they surrounded me and grabbed me by the neck and then proceeded to drag me off into a back area.
The protester who shot this footage captured Vashti Kenway's arrest on video.
We would appreciate if you just settle down, please, and refrain from
They essentially said that this was for the crime of sort of speaking out, that I'd been one of the people who'd been on the megaphone giving speeches, encouraging people to be firm in their resolve against Max Brenner. And so this was such an insult to both the Victoria Police, the owners of QV and so on, that they decided that they would come out and take away sort of key leading activists.
So the arrests had nothing to do with our behaviour or anything like that. It was purely about silencing this demonstration and making sure that no one could learn of the links between Max Brenner, the Israeli army and the Australian government.
What caused such a brutal crackdown on a small group of peaceful protesters? Insights into the police's stance came out in the subsequent trial. 16 of the 19 activists arrested appeared in Melbourne's Magistrate Court in May 2012. Protesters pleaded not guilty to a string of charges, including besetting, resisting arrest, and the Kafkaesque charge of trespass in a public place. The police came across these charges when researching obscure laws that could be used against the activists. The oxymoronic charge of trespass in a public place surfaced because Max Brenner is located off QV Square, part of a privately owned shopping complex. When the complex was privatised, Melbourne City Council regulated that QV Square must remain a public place. Thus, the management and the police had no right to demand that the protesters leave for peacefully expressing their opinions. In court, the police conceded that they had misconstrued the public nature of this space when planning their response to the protest. During the cross-examination of Senior Sergeant Falconer, he admitted that the police's decision to crack down on the protest was influenced by some other recent activism around Melbourne. The decision had been made. Force Command had committed 160 police. Something needs to be done. They need to learn what's legal and what's not legal. The police were also forced to concede that the activists were entirely peaceful. There is no record of any police officer or any member of the public being injured at the protest. Evidence presented in the trial made it clear that the only violence at the protest was by the police against the protesters. However, the Australian mainstream media managed to largely evade this crucial fact. What little mainstream media attention this event received was aimed at painting the protesters to look like violent anti-Semites, with the Rupert Murdoch-owned paper The Australian leading the way. The spectacle of protesters breaking the law in an attempt to harm a legal Jewish business was all the more abhorrent because it invited the obvious historical parallels to the anti-Semitic targeting of Jewish businesses in the 1930s Nazi Germany. This article even went as far as to claim that 3 police officers were injured during the protest. However, the court case made it categorically clear that this never happened. And even after the verdict had been released, the Herald Sun, another of Rupert Murdoch's newspapers, reiterated this falsification. Media representations such as these are at the forefront of creating and reinforcing the myth that the protesters are violent racists. Prominent reactions to the protest voiced in the public sphere were overwhelmingly against the activists and frequently alluded to their mythical violence. Soon after the protest, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd was one of several high-profile Australians to stage a sit-in in solidarity with Max Brenner and the State of Israel. Paul Howes, the secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, said the activists were mimicking the behaviour of Nazi thugs. And Attorney General Greg Smith described the violent activist protests against Jewish businesses as being eerily reminiscent of Jewish pogroms of earlier times. Indeed, public support for the protesters has been relatively thin. Noam Chomsky, Norman Finkelstein, Jamal Nassar, John Pilger, Anthony Lowenstein and Robert Foster of the Rap News have been among the few brave enough to voice their support for the protesters. The initial results for this important trial were announced on the 23rd of July 2012. Magistrate Simon Garnett dismissed all charges of besetting and trespass in a public place. He said that the charges pursued by the prosecution would contravene the protesters' right to freedom of expression as enacted by the Victorian Charter of Human Rights.
I think it is a really positive response from this magistrate because it's an indication that corporations do not have the right to say who comes into their spaces, on what basis, and on the basis of political protest. So it's a real victory for political protest in Victoria. I think it's a victory for freedom of speech and civil liberties, and also I think it's a big victory for those of us who are determined to continue to speak out in support of Palestine.
The police's unsuccessful attempt to prosecute the activists may cost the public an estimated $1 million in court expenses. Police Chief Commissioner Ken Lay dismissed the protesters' claim that this was a landmark decision. He said, "I'm not seeing a decision that changes forever the way that we police these particular demonstrations. If we see businesses put at risk, if we see people's safety put at risk, we're obliged to take action." Victorian Premier Ted Baillieu condemned the BDS movement, and he said that his government is considering reforming legislation to heighten police powers in order to prevent another such defeat. Nevertheless, the mood was very positive when the protesters returned to Max Brenner a few days after the verdict was announced. There, they staged an event called Reclaim QV Square, which celebrated the activists' victory. The event was attended by a number of diverse organisations, including members from the gay marriage and refugee rights campaigns, WikiLeaks and Socialist Alternative, and, of course, the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. These activists are reaffirming their resolve to protect civil liberties, the freedom of expression, and the right to peaceful assembly because, as they see it, the global war on dissent is far from over. I'm Tim Strom reporting for the Real News Network in Melbourne, Australia.